Hello and welcome everyone. I'm Michael Morris. I'm the co-director of Artangel. Sometimes you come across a book that you feel the urge to share as widely as possible. And if you read Ilya Kaminsky's Deaf Republic, you'll know what I mean. It's a poetry collection like no other, with a visceral and unsettling impact that resonates far beyond its pages. And back in 2019, it led us to invite Kaminsky to be part of an Artangel project we were developing for Orford Ness on the Suffolk coast. Known locally as the Island of Secrets, for most of the last century, the Ness was occupied by the Ministry of Defense as a research center. It's the place where radar was developed, a vast expanse of windswept shingle, which also became a detonation site for bomb ballistics and other weapon systems. These days, it's a nature reserve managed by the National Trust, but its military history is never far from the surface. We called our project Afterness and invited several artists to make new works for the dilapidated test sites that punctuate the landscape. Meanwhile, we commissioned Ilya Kaminsky to write I See a Silence, a cycle of poems inspired by the Ness and experienced as a recorded soundtrack for the walk across the shingle between sites. Ilya's about to join us from Atlanta, and he'll begin by reading a selection of these new poems before being joined in conversation by poet and playwright Inua Ellams. You can post questions for Ilya on the YouTube chat or via Twitter using the hashtag #AfterNess, and he'll answer as many as possible following the conversation. Now, over to you, Ilya.
Hello, I'm most grateful to be here. Thank you so much, Michael, and everyone at Artangel who has been able to help with this project. It's been an amazing experience for me. And today I'm most grateful to be in conversation with Inua about this project and to share the poems for you. Without much further ado, I will just read some poems and we'll see where it gets us. As you might have noticed that I speak with a pretty heavy Russian accent, so hopefully by the end of this 24 hours that we spend together, you will all also speak with a pretty heavy Russian accent. But just in case, I hope there are closed captions for everyone to follow. So some poems. Arrival. Arrival. While the young wind of Ness grips scraps of paper, helpless in its hands, I surrender to you, girls. You can have the afternoon. All I ask is a moment of quiet. I, a deaf man, want some quiet. I want some quiet. This is how once or twice in his life a man stands up and says, I have nothing except my body and the shingle spit. All I ask is a moment of quiet. I, a deaf man, want some quiet. I want some quiet, and quiet frames him like a doormat. Questions for visitors. What will you do when the dandelion leaves glist and list? And what will you do? On this beach, you have dragged the dirty lining of your body's roof. What will I do? I will stand without the camouflage of speech. I, nothing much, a man only. Owls. The owls wake up nest, pecking against the windows of the 21st century, as if looking for the inventors of the atomic bomb. Who? A spell against bomb makers. This, officers, is a common chickweed, cousin of the prickly southeaster. If you lean your ear to her stem, you can hear yourself living. After her funeral, I became an environmentalist. I love the planet because my mother is in it. I lie down and kiss the earth's pink, golden forehead. Facts. In fact, God is a little insect limping up the windowsill, carrying a breadcrumb, up, like a sharpened cart. But on Tuesdays, God is a misanthropic frog croaking, hello, how lovely, across 4 a.m. moss hunks. By nights, Owl is demanding release of information on God's trespassing. Who? Into which each man rides the broken horse of his spine and is not afraid. Rain has eaten 1/4 of me, yet I believe, against all evidence, these raindrops are my letters of recommendation. Here is a man worth falling on. Mosquitoes are drilling in the air hole with their voices, tiny glass hammers. I want 1,000 helium balloons. I want 1,000 helium balloons attached to the armory, made be light like a rabbit slang, made swell with me, and lift up above the island, above the water, above England, which is probably also a helium balloon. Underneath, her gulls, like old women, eat breakfast and gossip mid-flight. Turnip mass, like a prophet Isaiah, flutters poetically above the pack market pathway, hoping to baptize someone, anyone, a gull perhaps, or a sea mouse ear. And finally, a little poem called Aftermath. What I saw at Mass is how silence fixes us. How now, in taxis, in post offices, in barbershops, Magnum Mysterium, I see it now. It moves in benches. Who am I? I am on my knees, I see. How through the cavities, in a man's molars, wind whistles, Magnum Mysterium, I see. Silence is a self-defense of people's Spartan people, in whose faces other people's silence peers, who watch others watching them watch, who don't know they are being watched. Magnum mysterium, I am no one, just a man standing on air's thin shoulders. Thank you.
Hi, Ilya. Thank you for that really captivating, hypnotic, moving, ominous, but specific and precise reading. I could keep on adding adjectives here and there, but it was magnificent to hear these poems from this book, which I've sat with since Michael sent them to me. Thank you so much.
Okay.
Yeah. I have a few questions. One, like Michael said, I read Death Republic and loved it. And there's a friend of mine called Raymond Antrobus, who's also an acquaintance of yours, and we've met and discussed your poems. So it's a pleasure to be here with you. And I've also been a fan of Artangel's work. So these feels like the Avengers united in the presentation here of this evening. I wonder if you could tell me a little bit about how you got involved with Orford Ness. Were you aware of Artangel before Michael reached out to you? And what was it like to write about a place you had never visited before?
First of all, thank you for being here and in conversation. It's truly an honor for me and a pleasure, a delight to be in conversation with you and to know that you have read this book. I'm really grateful. Thank you. Truly. Having said that, just trying to answer your question, this one is easy. Michael got in touch, and it is a great organization. I have heard about it from other poets who were delighted with it, with the conversation that it creates. And so I was grateful to be in this kind of conversation. And at first, as Michael probably already mentioned, we planned the visit, and the visit didn't happen because world goes on and creates pandemics and crises, and that's a tragedy that it always does to us. And so Michael had to kind of change the parameters and kindly agreed to put faith into the idea of having a conversation with a place I have never visited. And to my mind, it became a kind of a metaphysical opportunity, if you will.
Mm-hmm.
And it became so for probably a number of reasons. And I probably won't be able to even discuss in detail all of them, but I'll try some of them. Number one, as I mentioned, we are in a crisis of all kinds. And for some people, a crisis just began. For other people, a crisis has been ongoing for centuries. And ignored by so many. How do we deal with it? As a poet, one has to pay attention to the world. One has to tune into the music of the world. One has to speak against silence. But as a poet, we also know that we need a dwelling space for the language to generate, for the music to happen. Without silencing it, any kind of music is sort of noise, right? It's ongoing noise which music articulates. It puts stops and creates rhythm. So there's more than one kind of silence. And that was interesting to me. Now, Ness itself provides kind of a, and especially after Ness provides a kind of a metaphysical / historical possibility of how do we deal with history as it is ongoing, even though we are also in the present, with every changing minute, in the present of after history. how do we negotiate the two? I mean, for me, even though I never visited the place, it's a very personal thing, because if you think about it, where were all these nuclear weapons pointing to? Well, they were in fact at that place. They were pointing at the Soviet Union, where my parents lived, where I lived, where I went to school, where I was 15, 16 years old, when these weapons were pointing at those places. So it is very personal. It's also personal because how do we speak to this entity called planet Earth, on which we live, and so much of human drama, so many human wars and injustices are kind of the noise that we create to not be in conversation with the planet. The anxieties that we impose on each other in order not to pay attention to what really matters. Because as soon as we die, we enter the planet, literally. My mother is inside the planet right now. Okay, so how is the planet not personal to me? How is not utterly immediate to me? And Ness provides this opportunity of what happens when, for a moment, history kind of doesn't necessarily change, because it never changes, but transforms into another stage, another motion that it takes. It was one form of empire. Now, empire never really stopped. It's a beautiful lie that it stopped, but it just took a different form. And Ness is a visual representation of this. And a question for me is, as an artist, it's a moment when a lot of artists, myself included in my previous book, we kind of scream. It's a moment of a scream where we respond to injustice around us at a high volume. And Ness provides an opportunity to see how we can respond in a different register as well. To, yes, respond to the crisis of the moment, but also respond to the planet as well. I hope it's a very long answer, forgive me.
It's a brilliant answer. Apologies for my doorbell. Because WhatsApp has gone down, I have the keys to my neighbor's flat, and she couldn't anyway. So it's gonna go off again. I'm gonna have to dart off. But thank you for your answer, which was really expansive and is what I expected, given your mind and reading this book. I do have one question to follow up. You talked about how there are many types of silences. And in the first poem, Arrival, you say, as a deaf man, you say you arrive as a deaf man and you want some quiet. So talk to me about what kinds of quiet you're searching for when you arrive in After Ness, in Orford Ness. What kind of quietness do you think Orford Ness bestows on a deaf man?
Thank you for this question. There are different kinds of, let me see if I can have a look at it. There are different kinds of quiet. You ask about the first poem, and I immediately think about the last one. When in the middle of the last one, we say, silence is a self-defense of people's pattern, people in whose faces other people's silence peers. And that is the kind of silence that we talk a lot about in our culture, the kind of silence that I would think is almost invented by the hearing, because silence is an invention of the hearing. Deaf people don't really believe in it. So what does one believe in when one is questioning the fiction of silence? And a kind of stillness out of which creative regeneration may come, but also a kind of stillness in which one can watch the wither of the planet itself, the wither of the planet that is happening while everything human is also happening, the parallel drama, the drama of those little rabbits, the gulls, the plants, the water. How can one enter in conversation with that? So on one side, as I mentioned, we speak against silence. But on another side, it is silence that moves us.
Mm. Thank you.
Thank you.
Another thing you talked about, and the line just jumped out at me. It's in the poem called "Questions for Visitors." You say, "What will I do? I will stand without the camouflage of speech," and that struck me because I never think of speech as hiding things, but there is a profundity which silence brings between individuals, and I wondered if that was what you were hinting to. What is camouflaged, and what do you think you see that the hearing don't? Or what do you think you hear that the hearing don't?
Thank you for this question and for close reading of the book. As a poet, as I'm sure you will agree, we kind of we love language. We are completely delighted by it, love it, impassionate by it, but we also question it. We know how much propaganda, but propaganda is an easy way out too, just to point to question propaganda. How much inadequacies, how inadequate it is to express a simple emotion, how many misunderstandings arrive from a simple world. As somebody who comes from hard of hearing community, there are all other kind of things because I grew up lip reading. My native language is not really Russian and definitely not English. It is the language of reading lips. So, just Ukraine now growing up, then Soviet Union, I would see a person in the street speaking, I would read their lips, but I would also see somebody behind them at the balcony opening a newspaper, somebody feeding their dog, somebody shouting across the street, somebody falling from a bicycle. And all of that was a part of a sentence. Like grammatically, syntactically, poetically, a part of a sentence, a part of what one takes in when one watches lips move. To give you a better, more precise, in fact, scientific kind of perspective on this, is an experiment that was done a few decades ago when scientists put, let's say, I don't remember the exact number, 4 hearing people from different parts of the world in the same room. Let's say from Russia, Mexico, Poland, and South Africa in the same room, and left them there for 6 hours. When they come back, what did they see? They saw people sitting in 4 different corners and looking at each other with a little bit of suspicion, waiting for time to pass. Then they did the same thing when they put 4 deaf people from those different cultures, different parts of the world, who did not have the same sign language, because sign language is not universal. Even British and American sign language are different languages. When they put them in the same room and then left for 6 hours, what happened after they come back? People were creating a new language together. So that shows a kind of separation, not just from nature, but from our very own bodies. And I think every single poet completely relates to that. Poetry is a search for the vivid language. The empire wants us to be all like this. Squire, all like dull, right? Empire wants dull language. The poet, by definition, wants to break the rules of all of dull language, wants to have vividness of speech, speech that speaks to bodies. Lorca, a great poet of Spanish language, said poet is a professor of senses. He didn't say poet is a professor of creative writing at the university. He said poet is a professor of senses. And I think that is what is interesting. And a place like Ness shows it so vividly, almost too dramatically, if you will, because suddenly culture as we knew it in the 1950s is gone. When all this nuclear weaponry was alive and soldiers were marching like this, speaking the language of this, is gone. And now we have beasts. And now we have little gulls and a ruined lighthouse. But that is also language, that is also speech. And that's a different camouflage of speech.
Yeah.
The speech given to us on TV by politicians.
Yeah, thank you. like you said, in Ness, we have lighthouses, we have gulls, and we also have owls. And in one of the poems, the one called Owls, you end with a play on words where the owls say who, and it's the sound that owls make, but it also refers to perhaps some of the creators, some of those who worked at Orford Ness. Now, owls occupy a particular sort of position in urban mythology, in mythology generally. They are the wise ones, the all-seeing sort of birds. And I wondered if you could talk to me a little bit about what they played for you, discovering them at Ness, but also the play on words of who on sound, and if you're hyper-conscious of both when you write.
Thank you for this question, and again for your attentiveness. I really appreciate it. I guess I will have to step back a little bit and admit right away that my native language is not really sound, it is images. Simply because, again, growing up hard of hearing and lip reading, image is something I feel far more comfortable in. And if I look at both of your question about sound and where I come from, image, and speak about the transition, I really have to point out that it is a language of poetic devices, poetic tools that poets are speaking in. We don't really speak English or Russian or Ukrainian and so forth. We speak the native language of images, of line breaks, of a figurative language, of alliteration, assonances. So for me, if I have to ask what is an image, I would say image is an international language. No matter what culture one is in, one gets an image, it's a motion picture. One may get a very different idea of what that image represents, but still gets an image. Now, sound can be a little more complex. It is more local, if you will. I don't know, since we are talking to the audience from UK mostly, let's say, Blake, tidier, burning bright, in the forest of the night, what immortal hand that I could frame thy fearful symmetry. Now, when you're growing up as a child, it might be a lullaby, very sweet one that your mother is singing to you. But then you grow up and you think, what the hell? It's a form of a spiritual drama, spiritual turmoil. What the hammer, what the chain, and what furnace, what thy brain. And all of that is embodied in sound. And if you translate it into Russian, say, or Ukrainian, that meaning can be completely lost. It can be a poem about a big cat, depending on translation. Now, what you're referring to is things like repetition or rhythm. That for me is kind of curious because rhythm can be translated between languages, can be stolen from one language to another. The simple example would be poets as different and yet as similar as Porcelain and Ennerbis Philip, who really create a language of rhythm that becomes their own. Somebody like Celan writes against German. It's not supposed to make any sense in English, a different language, which doesn't really participate in the Celan's drama with German. And yet it makes total sense because of how rhythm embodies human feeling. Same thing with Ennerbis Philip, a poet from Trinidad, living in Canada, and writing quite a bit and very movingly about colonialism and what it means to grow up in the language of the empire, which doing horrible things, even as you're writing in that language. English is a mother tongue, she says, but let me remember it. She does a rhyme of language anguish, where a language becomes a lot more when you break it. And it shows that brokerage shows a lot more meaning than the actual order of noun, verbs, and adjective, and so forth.
Yeah.
So that kind of rhythm is what I'm interested in. But again, as poets, we try to speak in more than one poetic tool. And so I try to play a little bit with sounds that are with vowels and see where they would take me.
I think that's a great thing to meditate on. As a Nigerian, as an African, English was also forced on my country through colonization, and because of it, it's the only language I speak. My parents are from various other parts of Nigeria, but the only language they speak in common is English. So I grew up speaking only that, which means that there are aspects of my heritage on my father and my mother's side which I can never access. So as much as I find freedom within language, I'm also caged within it, caged from other aspects of my identity. And in writing as well, is like you say, we try to hack language, we try to break the spell of language in order to create new spells. And it's something you meditate on in the poem called A Spell Against Bomb Makers. You say, this officer is common chickweed. And in your poem, chickweed is cast as if in witchcraft against bomb makers. Can you talk a little bit about the links between making spells and poetry, about creating incantation, and how and what balm, what sort of medicine then poetry and can brings to humanity, what it can heal?
Yes, thank you so much for the question and for sharing your perspective on it, which is so important and so necessary, because if poetry doesn't ask these questions, it becomes stale so quickly. It can only be alive if it adjusted real human, dramatic, metaphysical, personal questions of language, of these devices, of what they represent. Now, to go into your question of spell, it is so easy to become a new agey and spells and let's have a campfire here and dance around it. Well, I'm more for dancing around campfires. Let's do that. But how do we get into what you're really asking? The memorability of speech, the pattern that's creative, that one wants to remember the poem and wants to come back to it, or a kind of poem that one almost understands but not quite, and yet it doesn't push one away that mystery, but calls one, woos one, makes us want to come back to this poem next year and 2 years after and 10 years after. That kind of memorable speech cast a spell on us. I once talked to somebody in a class from Australia, and I said, "Oh, you're from Australia. You might want to read this poet Les Murray." And they read it, and they come back and they said, "Oh, I was crying because it's written in kind of a Australian colloquial speech that my parents spoke, and I don't speak anymore because I live in America now. It gave me a whole other register of language." And if you think about it, that kind of information that poetry doesn't just give, but enacts. It's also kind of a spell that it casts on us. It's not about an event, it is an event. I wish I knew how to do it. One can try and fail again and fail better. But that is what one is hoping for, right? It's a kind of a speech that continues being fresh, continues being new, long after the event has passed, because the patterns of that speech has contained a certain life of an event, has become an event on their own.
Yeah, I think that's a really illuminating answer. But I think you have done it in this book, as you have in other books of yours. You definitely do cast spells. I wanted to talk a little bit about the other poem. After her funeral, I became an environmentalist. As a Nigerian, I'm aware of environmental titans from my country, including the writer Ken Saro-Wiwa, who has twin daughters who are friends of mine. Ken was framed by the Nigerian government and Shell and eventually executed. So his death weighs heavy on Nigerian environmentalists, and I think others who are fighting for the planet. I just wanted to talk a little bit about this poem specifically, and how you say, "I love the planet because my mother is in it." I think Nigerians are hyper aware of the destruction of the planet because Kensarawiwa is in it. Which leads me to the question, if you think death is integral to love, do you, in the same way you love the planet because your mother is in it, do you think those things are both sides of the same coin? Can we separate them?
Yeah, thank you for this question. I wish I could answer it. It's a question we leave hoping to answer, right? I think one thing one realizes when a person you love passes from immediate conversation with you, which is this life, is the more you grieve, the more you hurt, is a really reflection on how much you love it, right? You're hurting so much because you love it, not because you did something wrong or something horrible happened. Of course, something horrible happened, but it happens to everybody. You're grieving so much after death because you love it so much in life. And that for me was one of the lessons I didn't know. It's that I learned it, unfortunately. But I do have to say, more in context of this specific project, I really had to kind of think about what am I going to write about if I write about this place where horrible things happened and horrible things were planned. And if I just stand up there on a podium and say horrible, 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 people are kind of expecting that. They delegate it. I would just play another little role of a shouting poet in a capitalist framework where capitalism already expects us to do it, you know. So how do we turn it on its head? How do we make people stop and think about it, of what really happened and how to go on after what happened? I mean, the whole idea of Hiroshima, of Chernobyl, of all the other things that were done with nuclear power, what creates after, what is happening after them? There are still right now people moving back to Chernobyl, which is still terribly contaminated. People are moving back to the area. The natural life never stopped. It had been incredibly hard. It can be incredibly transformed. Who knows how? We don't even know all the answers. But just watching it might give us some kind of perspective on how to live after something like this, how to live after disaster. For me personally, I was very much a city boy all my life. I grew up in Odessa and then moved to US and lived in places like DC or San Francisco and so forth, now in Atlanta. So very much a city person. But after somebody you love dies, you begin to wonder about cities as also kind of a narrative that we tell to ourselves, that we create, and thereby ignore the life of the planet of which we are very much a part. So for me, this project was a kind of a way to stop myself a little bit and to just stare to watch around.
I completely see that, and how you had to, and how you take on so much, both the natural world, how you shed so much of your city living in order to be really present in Orford Ness. For me, that is also really suggested in this line, in the title of this poem, which simply goes, "Into which each man rides the broken horse of his spine and isn't afraid." So the title itself, "The Broken Horse of His Spine," suggests that the man here is both animal and man, is both urban and suburban, is both rural and urban, and it just is so evocative of both this connection, but also the connection and the potential for connection. In this same poem, you say, "Rain has eaten a quarter of me, yet I believe against all evidence. These raindrops are my letters of recommendation. On first reading, I thought then the recommendation would be to God, to a God figure saying this is a good man. But instead, the recommendation from the rain is that here is a man worth falling on. So it doubles down on itself, really roots the man here in the landscape rather than reaching towards something beyond. I was wondering if the letter of reclamation is to a god or is to a sort of superhuman figure. How do you hold on to that idea of something greater than us and perhaps a positive force in a wasteland like this, which speaks to violence and structured, planned, dedicated, deliberate violence?
Once again, I wish I had the answer. Yeah. I guess, and that is very personal, very private answer. I can only speak for myself alone. But I do have to say that at this point in 21st century, to me, as one human, it is pretty clear that organized religion has become a corporation, a corporate entity. But the questions that it has posed from early on, what does it mean to be a human? How do we address the universe? The idea of a psalm, of a prayer, is standing up and addressing the universe. I don't necessarily care which particular denomination, which particular narrative is slapped on that universe that's all around us, of which we are very much a part. But this address of a human being to something larger than us is not going to go anywhere, whether or not the particular corporation of a particular organized religion is relevant or not to a particular culture. To me, what is interesting is, like, right now, unfortunately, we are here on an online platform. I wish we were in Atlanta sitting in my kitchen and drinking tea. I have some here. And talking about all those things in person as two humans. And to my mind, two human beings asking these impossible, really, questions of each other is the beginning of a relation, is the beginning of a certain pact, of a certain connection, which is far more interesting to me. A kind of ritual that matters as opposed to ritual that is just there to busy people up so they don't look and see who is stealing what from whom. That kind of connection of asking questions together humanly, intimately, of each other at the kitchen table is what is interesting to me. Because we have done it as a species since forever. And as any poet would know, poetic devices also come from this kind of conversations. Say a poetic device such as repetition, according to what anthropology tells us, and I only took one class in anthropology back in college, so I'm not an expert. But what it tells us is, once upon a time, yes, around a campfire, a bunch of us who didn't have a language yet already began to have fire. And a leader of community at that time, a shaman, said fire, 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 and so on until he dropped. And everybody looked like, what just happened? What happened is the language was used in the early stages of human development as more than just means of conveying information, of calling something into being. You called it a spell. Another person might call something else. But this kind of humans in a small group talking to each other and trying to address something they understand or think is larger than what they are, or don't understand is a mystery to them, but mystery that calls us, that makes us want to come back and ask the question again. It's something that is kind of, I think, timeless and interesting, and I don't pretend to have answers. I just marvel at it here with you.
Yeah, thank you. Talking a little bit again, just about the incantation of the word fire. There's a poem called Mosquitoes here. I grew up in Nigeria until I was 12 years old, where I was attacked by those little insects over and over again. I suffered from malaria a few times. And reading this poem here did suddenly take me back to those experiences of these little things buzzing around. And you describe them as drilling in the air a hole, which is so specific and a precise a description of the noise they make when they flit past you. But in my experience, that hole was a black hole, and it also came with a very real fear because of the friends of mine who suffered from malaria and those extended members of my family who actually passed with it. James Cameron talked about making Avatar, and he got the idea to make that film when he was creating Titanic. They'd built this little robotic submarine, which was trawling the beds of the Atlantic Ocean looking for this ship. And he said that he felt like his consciousness had been transported into this little ship, which was sailing through the riverbed, through the ocean bed. And I wondered then if the Mosquito perhaps gave you that same sense of being in Orford Ness. Did it transport you there? Are you mosquito or man in this poem?
Interesting, very interesting. And thank you once again for giving me a window to see the context of the question, which is so important. Thank you. Wow, that's an interesting question. I guess, honestly, for me, it's always the because it's not my native language. Um, Poetry is so tied up to simply not knowing the word sometimes. So you have two words, but you don't know the third. In this case, mosquito drills. Is it the right word? Not right word. But partly when you come in into the new cultures, having come to UK, and for me coming into the different language, entirely different language, one really has to rely on figurative speech. I might not know the third word, but I know the other two, and so I can make them do something unpredictable, make love to each other and make a baby, which is a metaphor or a simile or a metonymy or any other poetic device. So they create something I didn't expect. And it comes out of a need, out of luck, because it's not my native language. But it is also a kind of a luck, a kind of a fortunate thing, not to know the third word and to say the predictable, but to wonder and see what else can mosquito do, or what else a kind of a word describe or become. And I didn't really expect either a mosquito or a man of your question, but I'm glad it happened that a reader would adopt such a question. But that really, for me, happens because of a figurative language. Because I was wondering, well, what can I say that mosquito does that is active, that is real? And I didn't think of malaria that you described. That's a whole different window for me. But of course, you're right. Of course, it is true, and it happens as we speak. But I think this is the beauty of what poetry can offer to us, is kind of a figurative speech that can be true no matter where or why or how it's approached. And that is why poetry is an obsession for me, because it can allow this opportunity. It doesn't mean that I get it right, but I'm obsessed with it because it is possible.
Yeah. So you might have stumbled into this accidentally again, but in page 38 of this beautiful book, you describe England as a helium balloon. And for me, that also perfectly describes where this country is now politically. Having detached ourselves from the European Union, we are floating sort of borderlessly, without connections to our neighbors. Even right now, where there's fuel shortages right across the country, is because of distribution problems, because we have left Brexit, and we've left the European Union is a result of Brexit. And I wondered if that was deliberate, if you will, or if those were deliberately asked political connotations, or if, again, this was just stumbled upon, and if there are other poems, other lines in this book or poems that speak to politics more directly.
Oh, sure, absolutely. I can't imagine how not to think about all of that
Yeah.
in this moment. And to my mind, there's a lot. I've heard these lines earlier, just to repeat them again from the last poem. Silence is a self-defense of people's spat on people in whose faces other people's silence peers. This image that you are giving us now, the Ilya the balloon, is of course it is so. The question for me is again, in this kind of context with such an outside subject of nuclear weaponry, I think it would be too easy to dismiss one saying, yeah, it's bad. Yeah, separating building walls is bad. Of course we know it's bad. If we don't know it is bad, oh my God, we need to go back to school. You know. But I think what I tried to do was to point out, hey, folks, we all die. So why are we doing this crap? Let's pay attention to what happens after we are gone, and what have we done while we're here. The other thing that I want to say is this kind of division that happens a lot in North America and Western Europe specifically, and only, is separation of poetry into political poetry and non-political poetry. And forgive me for my Russian, but it is bullshit. That separation is completely artificial. The neighbors and leaders of Pablo Neruda, Anna Akhmatova, or numerous other poets would never dream about calling their poetry political poetry. No, it was a poetry about the lives of people around Neruda, around Akhmatova at that time. And that's why those poets became so much larger than life for their communities. And I think anyone who would separate poetry into political or not is really saying, well, I speak from a position of privilege where it is possible to separate those things. Well, it is not. I mean, any poetry is political. You can speak about Mosquito to be political, as you very much pointed out. And what is political is, if not two human people speaking to each other or not, or deciding not to speak when horrible things happen, or deciding not to point out beautiful things that happen. Poetry is not just about horror, because what kind of witness it is if you just witness 50% of what happens? What about the other 50%? It's our job to give a full picture, not only a part of it.
Yeah. Thank you again for a really expansive answer. I have a few questions from some of our viewers. The first one is from Deborah Kelly. Deborah Kelly, she asks, in a poem, how does emotion enter an object? In a poem, how does emotion enter an object?
That's a great question. I ask that myself every day. How do you write a poem? It's a great luck to write a poem. You kneel and pray to be able to write one. It's a mystery how emotion enters the subject. But luckily enough, we do have tools. We have poetic devices. Since I'm speaking from United States, I'll give you an example of American poets, say Walt Whitman. What are Walt Whitman's devices? Anybody who ever read Walt Whitman will tell you right away it's an anaphorical repetition at the beginning of every line. And that is true. But that's only part of the answer. If you see all the bad imitators of Whitman, you will see how they all imitate the anaphora and they don't achieve the power of Whitman, right? So how does Whitman get there? You close the anaphora, you close with your poem literary as you read the beginning of every first line, and you look at what happens in the rest of the sentence, the rest of the line, and you notice a lot of alliteration, a lot of assonance, really beautiful images like the world of slumbering and liquid trees. You notice the amazingly long sentence. Whitman used to be, believe it or not, an opera critic for a while. So his sentences try to be operatic. And those kind of poetic devices allow Whitman to put his oversized passion, oversized ego, if we are honest with each other, into his poems and make art out of them. It is that tension between craft and emotion that creates art. You don't just become Whitman by getting on the rooftop and yelling. You need to have art and craft, but you don't become Whitman by just knowing what anaphora and line break is. You need to have human need, human desire, human hunger, human attentiveness to other humans, human tenderness, human anger and fury. But we speak as poets in a language of poetic devices. We don't speak in Russian, French, and so forth. We speak in the language of poetry. And that allows us to deal with our emotions in a way that they become other people's emotions. To my mind, a great poet is not somebody who speaks from a stadium to thousands of people with a microphone. A great poet, perhaps, is a very private person alone in their room, who is able to ask questions, impossible sometimes questions, but eloquently enough, strangely enough, musically enough, so that the poem can speak privately to many people at the same time.
Thank you. I have another question from Emma Shardlow. She says, I'm a third-year literature student looking to write my dissertation on Orford Ness. How did you research for I See a Silence? Did you find inspiration from W.G. Sebald's Rings of Saturn, for example?
Yes, of course. There is a lot of great leadership by both dead and the living, like Macfarlane is very much living writer. Rings of Saturn is a great book about very much how do we deal with histories that pretends to have ended but hasn't. I also personally, number one, I need to read it, I need to know what others have done, but number two, I need to realize my own limitations and ask myself, how can I build something out of those limitations so they don't start, so that they stop being limitations that start being building devices. And in this case, I already spoke at length say about images. Much of this book is built out of images because I realized that, oh, that is something I can bring in. No one who has spoken about Orford Ness, he has spoken from a perspective of a lip-reading person. Now, I don't say in the book that I'm a lip-reading person. That's not my project. It might be an interesting project for somebody else. But what I try to do is look from that perspective and then ask, okay, what is strange? What is curious? I'm very much a person interested in the ongoing crisis, the endless crisis of our time. One German poet once said, the war is no longer declared, it is simply continued. And that was very much in my mind as I was writing these poems. But I wanted to write them in a vocabulary that was new for me. I just finished a kind of a story in verse, a fable in verse, Deaf Republic, which was trying to answer, for me, certain questions about our moment. And I thought, okay, is there a very different vocabulary that I can use? So the first question I asked Michael, who was really a true angel for me in this project, I asked it, what is flora and fauna of the place? What grows there, what lives there, who is living there now? How I can be in conversation with whoever living organism in the place. How can I understand that vocabulary, that language, and bring it into my work, into my perspective? So to put it simply, you want to ask yourself, number one, what is your obsession? What are you obsessed with? And number two, what are poetic devices that you're very comfortable with or want to learn about or fall in love with, that you can put in tension with that obsession? So you learn something new, both about your obsession and about these poetic devices, meaning English. What English can do in service of your obsession. What can your obsession do to attack English a little bit, to make it slightly uncomfortable? Okay, and by obsession, because you're human, most likely, I mean that you have obsessions that other people have, those impossible questions that we all have. So what it is that makes you want to go back to Orford Ness, from your perspective, from your life? And if you're writing a dissertation, not poetry, you will want to ask, well, what rhetorical questions do I have? What theories do I have? What theories that I love that are completely not about Orford Ness, that I can bring into Orford Ness to unpack it a little bit? What can I learn about it and from it, using the theories which I already know, if you're writing from a theoretical perspective? I, as a poet, write from perspective of poetic tools. So I had to ask myself that in a language of poetic tools. But the dialectics is still the same. We bring our obsession, our impossible questions, and we try to answer them with our tools at hand.
Thanks, Ilya. This is more a comment from Ruth God on YouTube. She says, it's amazing to hear Ilya say that he's a city boy. I thought his poetry was so incredibly rooted in the earth, its plants, sea creatures, that I heard at Orford Ness. So just more a comment, though you can add something to that if you want to.
Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, this is a question from Forrest Gander. He says, Dear Ilya, you remarked on the inadequacy of spreading emotion in relation to propaganda. Can you comment on what needs to be added to emotion for it to be an adequate thing to spread?
Well, Forrest always asks the most impossible questions. I think the knowledge of one's limitations would be the first thing to consider. Coming where I do from Russian tradition or Eastern European tradition rather, the first thing that I have to ask myself is what are the limitations of that tradition? Because that tradition is so heavily based in emotion. So the question for me would be, what is the intersection between idea and emotion, thought and emotion? How does our thought penetrate the mystery of the place, the mystery of questions that we try to answer, and yet are unable to? What makes us want to answer them? What are the ideas that underline our emotions to begin with? What is the structure of society that calls us to have these emotions? And remember, every time we have an emotion number one, it means that we cannot have an emotion number two. And oftentimes, society is structured in a way for us to have a particular response. And so, for me, having written a book of protest, I wondered, well, I have spent 15 years fighting Deaf Republic. What I have not been doing in those 15 years. What kind of vocabulary I did not engage with in those 15 years. Because every time we do something in this capitalist world, it means somebody else goes to the bank, right? So what else can I do to subvert the expectation? And the previous question or comment was, well, I'm a city boy, but how do I write about the land? How do I root myself in the land? It can be an emotional question, but it doesn't have to be. It can be really a question about society. How can I subvert the expectation of myself? How can I have or not have the emotion of a certain kind? The other things that I want to point out is a poetic temperament. In any point in culture, we value a certain temperament. So let's say in 1990s, Sebald, the author of Rings of Saturn, was perhaps the leading temperament of the moment in 1990s. The end of 20th century, they're looking back, they're trying to make sense of horrors that happened. Now, in 1920s, I think majority of humans would agree Sebald is probably not the leading spirit of the crisis we are in now. Folks are probably looking for a different kind of voice right now. And that is also an interesting thing to consider. What is it about temperament of the time that calls for a particular voice with a particular kind of temperament to reflect that time? For example, when we think about 19th century, we say, oh, this is a poet of 19th century. We would probably not say, I don't know, Emily Dickinson is a poet of 19th century. We would say that Byron is a poet of 19th century. That's true. That's not true at all. But that is how we are structured to think. We would say Alexander Pope is a poet of 18th century. We probably would not say Christopher Smart is a poet of 18th century. I found Christopher Smart's one poem from Jubilee Agnes so much more interesting than anything Alexander Pope wrote, even though Pope was a great poet. I'm not criticizing Pope here. I'm just saying there is really a disconnect between a human emotion, emotion of a poet, an emotion that speaks in culture to a particular moment in time. And that is also kind of interesting to think about and to see how we frame it as writers into it and how we can subvert that.
Thank you, Ilya. A few more questions. We'll be wrapping up soon, maybe to one or two more questions. A few people have mentioned the role of the sound design by Axel, I'm going to try and pronounce his surname, Kachuti, in the audio version of your poetry. How did this relationship come about, and how did the collaboration work? And please correct me if I mispronounce his surname.
That all came through Michael and through Artangel. The beautiful thing about Artangel is that, look, I'm here speaking about my poems, but Artangel is so much more. It's really an installation of different kind of arts, of different kind of voices. Sound design is its own universe that can take poetry and run away with it and create something entirely new, living in your ear, that I, as a hard-of-hearing person, is not even aware of. But that is the beautiful thing of what is possible to us in this moment in 21st century. That would not have been possible before, obviously, because of technology. That Artangel is really smart about using, about making art of, about subverting the expectations. And Michael would probably give much more interesting answer than I can. I can just say, I stand here amazed and watch what others do.
Thank you. And just to correct myself, the surname is pronounced Kakuti for those who are fans of his work. I have another question, Ilya. This is from Olga Grotova, and she says, Dear Ilya, what does your writing practice look like? Is it structured, like time or quantity based, or spontaneous?
Thank you, Olga. Well, you can probably see the bookshelf right behind me. It is not very structured. So my writing is not exactly structured. And I kind of delight in that. I delight in the chaos. I don't organize my books alphabetically. I organize them by poetic devices. The rhyme pose goes there, the metaphors pose goes there, the alliteration pose goes there, and so forth. Um, and that requires me to change my bookshelves all the time because, you know, some poets do alliterations, but they also do assonances and they also do line breaks. But I organize it by what I need at the moment, what a particular poem needs at the moment, the life of a poem. And so all my writing process, just as my library, is in service of that poem I'm trying to live inside of. It is very physical kind of activity for me. Sometimes I read the poem backwards, line by line. Sometimes I cut up the poem into lines. Um, Sometimes I read the first line, the third line, the fifth line, and so forth, and see what kind of discoveries can be made. Oftentimes, majority of the time, I write a poem and then I put it away for a few months or for a year, and I come back to it later. That is, Gogol's diaries, they're amazing this in his writing process. And he would revise whole novels by hand 8 times or more. He said 8 times was a minimum. And every time he rewrote it, he had to rethink, re-envision the whole thing, chapter by chapter. And I don't know, hey, if Gogol had to do it, who am I not to have to do it? You know, that's not even a challenge. It is kind of a delightful thing to live with the work, to live with words. Sometimes I have a little box or 5 little boxes on my table if my table is not messy enough, and I just cut little images I love into it, or little sounds that I love into it. So when I do have an obsession, when I do have something to say, I have materials to support myself with. It's like when you have an idea of what kind of house you want to build, you need door handles, you need bricks, you need cement, and it's nice to have it. But also those completely unrelated, wildly unrelated after images or bits of sound can completely change your obsession, make it grow, make it develop, make it take you somewhere else entirely. And that is the beauty of making this for me. So I don't dictate to it. I'm in conversation with it. I don't know if I could call it a writing process. It's more of a living process.
And I have the last question, which I think is rather apt. What is society without poetry? From Aaron Morel.
What is society without poetry? You know, I don't have imagination enough to answer it, other than to say Kafka already answered it, and it is not a society we want to live in. I mean, why would you want to live in a society without poetry?
Yeah. Thank you so much, Ilya, for your conversation and for your really, really expansive questions. No doubt those listening have enjoyed sharing this hour with your work and with your mind. I'd really like to thank those who are listening, who are watching on YouTube, for joining us for this hour, for tracking us down despite the global shortages in Twitter, sorry, in Facebook and Instagram and WhatsApp, and thank you for still finding us and sharing this evening with us. Ilya, is there anything you'd like to share with the viewers just before we go?
I just want to express my gratitude for everyone who had wasted their time listening to all of this. Thank you for believing in this conversation, and thank to you for being here and for being so attentive and so kind. Thank you, and thank you for your own writing, your own work, which is so important. And thank to Artangel for putting us together. To Michael, who has been doing this kind of conversations, this kind of surprises for decades. Thank you. And thank you to Charmian for creating despite of a technological problem, which I hear is happening right now with social media and other forms of communication, we're still here and we are still speaking. So thank you for that.
Thank you.